Today I wanted to share some wood splitting tips and things I've learnt over the years. I've been splitting wood as part of my job for 5 years now. Originally just a small part of landscaping work and an estate, but now it's full-time firewood and sawmilling. So I wanted to share some tips that I've learned over the years. So let's start off with some basics. Most important tip is to keep your chain out of the dirt. I see a lot of people cutting all the way through a log, surprising amount of people, when it's really unnecessary. Cut most of the way through the log, and then turn it over, and then cut the other side. You obviously cut all the things you want to cut on one side and then turn it over and then cut all the back cuts in one go. When it's easy you can turn it over by hand, but if it's got lots of knots or branches coming off it, clean them off and then use a felling lever. As you can see, chain goes nowhere near the dirt. It's not worth it. When you're swinging the axe, I see a lot of people also bring the axe head behind the head. This wastes energy and is very ineffective. Throw the axe out in front of you. Push it out like you're throwing a basketball. You can also swing over the shoulder, but I don't prefer it, and it does encourage you to be a bit sloppy. The arc of the swing is important to understand. When you swing the axe, the handle should end up parallel with the ground. If you swing in a circle, it'll end up in your shin or foot. So always bend your knees and keep the handle parallel with the ground, and you will never hit your foot. As you can see, a foot injury can be very nasty even in boots. I made a video on axe safety and splitting a while ago, which you should definitely check out if you want me to elaborate further. I'm just covering the basics now, but I'll put a link down in the description if you want to watch that. I'll go over splitting using mostly felling axes and some shorter handles, and generally about more safety tips, how the axe can glance. I also talk a bit about splitting in relation to like bushcraft axes, but I do cover it into a lot more depth than I do in this video, so definitely worth looking at. PPE wise, you want to wear chainsaw trousers when using the chainsaw, and steel toe cap boots. It's also good to have a first aid kit with you handy, and I generally carry a tourniquet and a trauma bandage. When you're using chainsaws and axes, the very worst things can happen, and you want to be prepared for it. So I always carry those in my bag. When you're splitting, you want to make a line of hits. If you hit the same place twice, it's not as effective as making a line of cuts across the centre of the log. Go across and make sort of like boards with it. Different axes can also work more effectively. As you can see in this beechwood, this thinner profiled axe made a much easier job of that. So like that. So having the right tool also helps. Sometimes it's not you, it's the combination of the axe you're using and the wood sets you up for failure. Splitting isn't about like showing off how manly you are. Splitting wood is a bit of a marathon rather than a sprint. You want to conserve energy and use the minimum amount of energy to get the job done, because you're not showing off to your friends when you're doing it for a job. Sometimes you need to hit the wood hard, sometimes you don't need that much power, so just save it, use different techniques, learn all the tricks you can. So under different contexts, in different working environments, you can be efficient. I watch guys online and you know, they're really good at what they're doing and what wood they're splitting, but I find that sometimes they get trapped into thinking they have the best way. But the truth is, I've tried all the different ways, and I use all the different ways, and they're the best under different circumstances. So always worth learning and having those tricks up your sleeve, but they're not universal. There's no best way of splitting wood. This green beech is splitting quite nicely. Some people say that when wood is dry it splits better. I do not agree at all. I think that when most woods I've found split better green. There are some that split better dry, but in reality just get it split as soon as it's feasibly possible and get it in the shed and drying out. As you can see here, this is beech that has been left to dry out for well, maybe a year and a half. And I'm hitting it with a much heavier axe. Beech tends to go like concrete when it's dry, and even with a hydraulic splitter it's very difficult. When it goes on the hydraulic splitter, when it does split as well, it explodes off. It's really like concrete and it shatters, and I've had some nasty bruises over the years with beech basically exploding and hitting my shin. So I prefer to split it green, despite what some of the old timer advice or old wives' tales say. So here we've got a piece of softwood. It's fairly straight grained, but it is typical of softwood and it's full of knots. So we've got a knot here, so that runs right to the middle of the log. We've got another one here. We've got another one here. And I think that's it. So the problem this presents is these knots do not split at all through these lines here. If you try and do that, you might be able to, with a very sharp axe, actually just cut through the knots, but it's just extra work. It's really something you want to avoid. So for softwoods, I've found in general the slabbing technique, where you take pieces off like this and work your way around, does not work very effectively. I found it's far better to go through the middle, either between the knots or directly through a knot, and yeah, break them down into triangle sections like pizza, and then split them down further. So in general, I found slabbing is a great technique for straighter hardwoods, but not for most softwoods with knots in them. So to start off with, I'll just demonstrate what it looks like when I try and slab a piece of softwood. That actually cut through the knot there. See, it's cut clean through it. It's a very sharp axe, this one. See, again, I'm cutting through the knot. Here's a much larger knot that I wouldn't have much hope of going through. I'll try it anyway for demonstration purposes. The rest of it would slab off quite nicely, but sometimes you'll get particular species and particular way they've grown is just horrendously bad with knots every single way, and slabbing does not work. try that. Another piece, slab. Yeah, that's successful. However, you can go right through the middle of the log, much easier. See? If you've got thin pieces that don't want to stand up very well, you can lie them down, cut them through the side. Same goes if the wood is cut on an angle, or it's axe cut wood where it's at 45 degrees and there's no way you can stand up. Just chop it lying down on the edge of a bog or another log. Now I'm going to split some oak, and oak is a pretty typical hardwood. I'm going to use a slabbing technique. It works very well when it's straight. So here you can see the problem with hardwoods is they don't tend to split very straight, especially when they're all knotty and wavy grained. And some of these little corners, no matter how best you try and avoid them, it will happen, and over time it will wear out the front of your handle. You can avoid that by doing the flick, hitting close, but it does just happen generally, so that's why I like these synthetic handles. They don't tend to do that. They last a lot longer. But this is the slabbing technique. You can either walk around the side or move the block and take a chunk off each time. There's one thing that's dangerous with this, and it's the axe can skip out to the side, hit you in the leg. Now I'm going to use a technique I like to do where I make basically boards and don't split through the centre or take off slabs. I make long splits to make as long a pieces as possible so that I can split them up like kindling, but just a bit bigger. Oak's not the best wood to do it with. Some of the really easy splitting woods like chestnut, a little bit of dry chestnut is really fast for this, and really low effort. You can sit there once you've got a nice stack of boards and smash them out faster than the processor. But it still works in oak. A little bit harder, but so using a splitting block is quite good when the ground's soft and you're splitting difficult woods. When it's really easy to split wood, you can sometimes want to split on the ground because it saves you having to pick the pieces up. Now, hitting the ground will damage your axe, but I prefer to break axes, not my back, so I do use my axe on the ground sometimes. There is a better way though, using the flicking technique. So the flicking technique is basically, as the axe hits the wood, you twist it so it forces the wood apart. It's really hard to get the timing right in order to like snap your wrists at the right moment, but I've found that if you hold the axe at 45 degrees roughly, and you just hold it at 45 degrees throughout your swing, so you're not changing anything, just up and down at that angle, it's really easy to get right. As you can see now, with using the flicking technique, I can chop up all this wood on the ground without hitting the dirt. Not that it's important, I prefer to look at axes as a cost, like tyres, where they'll wear out eventually, and I'd rather wear them out rather than picking up pieces all the time and breaking my back. So I'm not too worried about it, but it's nice to be able to protect them. Some guys like to use a tyre or bungee cord to hold their wood together. I think when you've got a lot of rounds, just lay them out flat on the ground and they kind of hold each other up anyways. So I've just put this one round in the middle, but when you have like 20 or 30 rounds all laid out, it's only the ones on the edge that don't get the support, but they do still support each other quite well, as is. So this saves you having to mess around with a bungee cord, and also saves you having to lift the piece into a tyre and then lift the split wood back off. Now you can just throw it straight in the trailer or wherever you're putting it to, wheelbarrow, and your handling is minimised and it's much faster. As you can see, using the flick and slabbing, sometimes going through the middle of them, sometimes slabbing off when necessary, or just constantly reading the wood. You can get very efficient, not picking anything up. Sometimes the pieces will be left a little bit big, like there'll be an odd piece with a big knot on it, and you just go back through and clean them up as you're loading the wheelbarrow or whatever. But 90% of it is good to go, and I'm not wasting energy. So another advantage with the flicking technique is it doesn't rely on the axe geometry. So here's with a very thin felling axe, an Ochsenkopf Iltis, which is absolutely unsuitable for splitting. I'm able to break up some of this wood, albeit it is straight grained, but it is beech and quite hard. There are limits to it, however, and using the flick technique with a thin axe is sometimes not that effective on very twisted and knotty pieces. But a thin axe is still effective in the right hands on straight wood. I'm not a fan of splitting with double bits. I used to like them a lot more, but recently I've went off them because the danger, the extra edge is a dangerous thing to trip and fall on, and also a dangerous thing to lay around. You know, if you're working with other people, they can also trip and fall on it. An alternative to the flicking is splitting horizontally. This is something else I've used in the past very effectively. It's ideal when you fell a tree, like a nice straight ash tree. So when splitting stuff horizontally, it's tempting to stand like this because this is more comfortable. However, if I swing like this and this moves or glances off, coming into my leg. So always imagine there's a line, stand here and swing past yourself, and then the glances will miss you. Alternatively, you can stand above it with a short handle, and the same again. From here, do your heels in front of it. So by splitting horizontally, you can split up a tree that you've just fallen, taking limbs off, very, very effectively. This is an ash tree which splits nice. But as you can see, I'm not picking anything up, and I'm getting it down to reasonable sizes which I can always go back over later. But all I've done is fallen the tree and then bucked it. So I've basically split most of the thing without ever touching a piece of wood. That can get chucked straight in the trailer and split down a bit smaller later, or split down smaller right now. So now we're going to go on to some more tough stuff and show you how to do that. One of my pet peeves is people who get two axes and smash them together, or stick an axe in a block and use a maul. You're just breaking your tools unnecessarily. So if your first axe doesn't stick it, rather than hit it, just use it to open the crack in another space. And then you can go back to your first axe, it will free it up, and just work between the two, rather than smacking one axe or the other. It'll make your tools last longer. Hitting two axes or two mauls together is very abusive because they're basically hardened the same, so they both get mushroom poles. And it can crack the eye as well, not to mention, especially in the case of two mauls, cause shards of metal to fly off and injure you. This is a piece of oak which is very, very hard. It's a bit too dry to split very easily, and my axe is just bouncing off it. I could go at this all day and waste time and energy. If you need to smack something, wedges are the way to go. They're designed to be hit, and they're softer than mauls, so it doesn't damage the maul. The wedge will wear out. Just for your information, this husqvarna axe has a hardened pole, which makes it very good for driving wedges. Most axes don't have a hardened pole. I prefer aluminium wedges. I find that they bite in better, they don't fall out as easy, they don't transfer so much shock to my arms, and they just do an all-round better job. They are a bit more prone to damage, as in mushrooming, but I think it's worth it, and they're easy to redress. I've also found that they don't break off pieces when they are mushroomed, like they don't fly off, they'll just crumble and fall to the ground, which is a bit safer. Quickly. Ideally use two wedges, but here you can see what can be accomplished with just one. This is a very, very big beech knot. Right through the middle of it. I don't think it gets any tougher than that. Wedges are also really good for splitting longer logs. If you want to make rails, or billets as sometimes known. These are easier to stack and transport compared to splitting the firewood short. So you can split billets and then leave them stacked off the ground in the woods, and they'll last a bit better, and you can come and cut them shorter with a chainsaw later. So they are an option. I work with a parallax processor, and I quite like using billets because they can go through the processor quite easily. Sometimes when the logs are slightly too big, I'll quarter it or halve it rather than chainsaw up, especially when it's ash and very easy to split. I wouldn't generally try and split something like this fast when I'm on the processor. So you can see a nice bit of ash where it's basically no knots and very straight, and it's also green. It's basically a full length log I've cut into 3, and then I split it down into billets quite effectively, just using the axe. Sometimes if it's a bit tougher, you can use 2 axes and then walk them along the log, or use wedges. But this is a nice log which is not necessary. You don't want to be doing this with elm. Here's another awkward piece. You can see is again where the tree's forked. So the best way of dealing with this is the bigger piece I'll slab off half, and I can slab off a small piece here and go through the middle. Taking those slabs off helps weaken it. So, first slab. I can go in half. And the next piece I'll slab off along here, hopefully. Okay, so now it's got the 2 centres, so line them up. So you can see there's a centre. The centre splits easy, the rest doesn't. So these are a much larger fork, and because this is dry ash, it's going to be a real pain to try and cut. So rather than try and split this, I'll just saw it in half, and you'll see how much easier it is. Now, this piece should be much weaker. It's not supported by the other piece. and now it's just this knot to contend with rather than both of them. See that? Centre again. And then this other piece, it should be the same. It'll be much easier. Now these are quite manageable. A bit more splitting. Historically, smaller diameter coppers would used to be used rather than big rounds, and I think that can still be done today. A lot of smaller wood that's just put in brush piles or burned because it's a hassle to chainsaw up, but with a thin felling axe it's very effective, and you can make a lot of small wood and kindling just with a felling axe. Ours would go to waste. An axe is a really efficient tool at breaking up like 3-inch limbs into small pieces of firewood. As you can see, by putting it on a stable chopping block or lying it across a log, you can cut up smaller limbs really easily, and the type of wood that you don't really need to split. Cutting this stuff up with a saw is really fiddly because it's very light and moves around a lot, and you've got to have some way of anchoring it down. So an axe is an ideal tool for breaking up these limbs. As you can see, I'm very fast and efficient. You can gather a lot of firewood that way. A lot of the firewood you'd probably just put in the brush pile because it was too much of a pain to cut up with a chainsaw. So there's a technique some people show, splitting kindling, going essentially like this and then dropping the two together. That's not very safe, I don't think. I've seen someone cut themselves really badly doing this, and because the axe slipped off, you know, and it came onto their thumb. If you want to do that, set it in gently and then take your hand out of the way. You can also lie it down and chop it through like that, or so when making kindling you want to go for straight grain softwood preferably, and make little boards. If you make a whole bunch of these boards and then get set up, so this technique is frowned upon by a lot of people, but it can be done very safely. When you get close to your fingers, you can stop. So now I've got a nice variety of different sizes to get the fire going. You don't want to hold it down here because this is more wobbly. In the middle or higher is better. I prefer to go higher. I just find it more stable. When you get to this stage and it's too dangerous to really hit your fingers, you know, if you've got 2 inches space, you have to be very inaccurate to hit your fingers. So but when you get down to this size, you can hold it here on the corner stump, So I know this technique is quite frowned upon because it is somewhat dangerous to your hands, but if you're skilled with an axe and you know what you're doing, it can be done perfectly safely. The trouble is people try to replicate it and they don't have that skill, but it is far faster than any other kindling method. Once you get your firewood split, obviously get it dry. It needs good airflow out of the rain and sun. Simple as that. There's a lot of different axes and tools you can choose from in the market. So it's nice to have a combination of different geometries and profiles for different work. Different wood split differently, and whether it's dry or green or has knots or no knots or needs to be hit hard or just needs a light chop to get through it, you want a combination, because there's no point swinging this if you don't need to, and this isn't quite enough. But if you're only going to have one axe, I'd say this one, the husqvarna, is just super useful, not just for splitting but all types of forestry work, and you could use it for construction and demolition work because of the hardened pole. It just takes a beating, and you can split anything with this and a couple of wedges. There's nothing you can't split with those two. So anyway guys, this is my experience, and I hope it was helpful. It's just a lot of things I learned over the years. There's a lot of different tricks and tips that I've learned, and generally just how to be efficient. Splitting wood is hard work, but there's no reason to make it harder on yourself. So having the right tools, using the right technique depending on the situation you're in and how you're loading and unloading the wood, and how you're getting it out of the forest, or whether it's in a timber yard or wherever, it's important to think about how you're doing stuff so you're not making it 2 times or 3 times harder and handling stuff more than needs to be done. The trick to being effective at splitting wood efficiently really is minimise handling. So hopefully everyone learned something, and I'm interested to see the comments, and hopefully can learn something from there as well. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.